This is part 2 of our symposium with Kat Duff. Duff is the author of The Alchemy of Illness. She has a private practice in Taos, New Mexico in counseling and neurofeedback, and she is a child forensic interviewer for investigations of suspected child abuse in New Mexico, helping children tell what they know in a safe environment. Kat discovered her writing abilities after developing chronic fatigue syndrome, a debilitating illness that rendered her mostly bedridden for 4 years. Frustrated by the lack of information and helpful guidance for living with illness, she began to write and to describe her experience for friends. That essay eventually developed into a book, The Alchemy of Illness, published in 1993. Kat is also a breast cancer survivor. Illness is a universal experience and something we don't talk about or contemplate mindfully. There is no privilege that can make us immune to its touch. But illness has its own geography, its own laws and commandments. Whilst Western civilization is focused on health care, Kat has inquired into the nature and function of illness itself. What she has to say is applicable to every illness and every one of us. For those of us who are sick, this book offers solace and recognition. For those who care for them, either physically or emotional, it offers inspiration and compassion. Finally, this fresh perspective on healing reveals how every illness is a crucible that tries our mettle, tests our limits, and provides us with an unparalleled opportunity to integrate its lessons in our lives. Kat is currently writing a book on sleep with a working title, The Secret Life of Sleep. She says most people take sleep for granted, yet our sleep patterns today, which have changed dramatically since the Industrial Revolution, may cause serious problems for people. Her book takes a multidisciplinary approach to sleep, drawing on contemporary neuroscience, ancient Eastern philosophy, historical and cross-cultural practices, and indigenous perspectives.
Kat, I want to ask you a question about toxins. And how illness is related to eliminating toxins, and what type of toxins do you think are responsible? It could be physical, I'm thinking emotional, even spiritual. You talked about inheriting things from your ancestors physically, and I'm just wondering what role toxins have in all of this, and if you could speak to that.
Yes. When I got chronic fatigue, and I was fortunately diagnosed very early on, and I feel so fortunate for that. And also fortunate to have found a doctor who worked more holistically, lived about an hour and a half away from me. And she worked a lot with allergies, so one of the first things she did was test for different things that my system might be reacting to. And she found several sensitivities. One was, for example, to printer's ink, which she asked me, she said, do you read a lot of newspapers or something? And I said, well, no, but I was a printer for a long time. And I was not a neat printer. I knew printers who could work with a printing machine in a white shirt and never get a smudge on it, but I was the person who always went home with smudges all over my face and everywhere. So I surely took in a fair amount of printer's ink, and it was one of many things that I had to get out of my system as much as I could, or detox. Lord knows how many other things became toxic in my system. They may not have been toxic in and of themselves, but getting to a certain point, in my system or in my particular body energetic field as opposed to someone else's. The amount of printer's ink in me may not have caused any problems for someone else, but certainly did for me. And I tend to think a lot about the post-war generation, partly because of the, mammoth antibiotics that came in at that time, but also all the plastics and oils based products that came into our worlds, and all of the detergents and pesticides that came into our foods, and all those chemical additives that were developed after the war, and even out of the chemical parts of things that were developed in the war, and how we grew up in a soup of that. I don't know how much. I have no way of telling whether I'm going off to the paranoid end and thinking that all of that is responsible for my illness or anyone else's illness, or whether that's reasonable. I don't have any way of knowing, but I do know that it is the nature of our bodies and our psyches to try to eliminate that which is not suitable or hurting us. And I think I refer to them as ingrained poison. Whatever, at one point I said in my book, whatever waits in the wings of our psyches, the buried memory, the unshed tears, the hidden yearnings, it's flushed to the surface in illness. Something that, even a hidden yearning, my desire to be a writer was one of the things that my illness flushed to the surface. I had a writing practice, but I never ever imagined that I could write a book or be a writer that would be interviewed somewhere. But that desire, rushed to the surface, to the forefront when I was sick. And I do believe that if I had been unwilling to follow that, at least to the next step, that unmet, unrecognized, invalidated yearning inside of me could have become poisonous, or already maybe was becoming poisonous or toxic. So it's, when I think of the toxins, I can think very concretely in terms of literal things like printer's ink in our environments and our worlds, but I can also think more psychologically or even spiritually in terms of that which is ignored or denied culturally or personally, and when it's held in for too long, becomes its own, starts to cause problems. It makes me think even of like you get a splinter and you try to take the splinter out and it breaks off, and it feels like it's a little tender still, but it feels like it's okay, and then a week later it's getting infected and the whole swelling up and getting red and making all this pus. It's going to come out one way or another. It will not let itself just sit there. Your body is going to bring it up and out. And I think our psyches are similar, and it's one of the things that I really love about health that includes illness as part of what is natural health. That it will bring things to the surface or try to evacuate that which does not suit us.
So then what about things that would help eliminate toxins, like a salt bath to draw out poisons and toxins, or cilantro to help to cleanse maybe metals in your system, or meditation perhaps, or dream interpretation to cleanse the mind? I mean, would something like that?
Oh, all of those things. And I haven't used the cilantro, and I didn't know about that, which is really cool. But for the printer's ink, I did hot as I could stand baths, and then wiping off the sweat so it wouldn't soak back in, and over and over and over again, and Epsom salt baths. I had a sauna, which I used for several years, in the same notion of detoxing. I certainly have used a lot of detoxifying herbs and supplements. Psychotherapy, body work, all ways of moving that out. I do think that when we get to the point where symptoms are really interfering with our lives, that's when it behooves us to try to find the medium that will bring forth and bring out those toxins. And whether it's dream work or salt baths or cilantro. We have to try to find those ways to assist the body. I think especially, I don't know why I think this exactly, but especially as we get older, when it's not as easy for our bodies to recover from things. I think we need to make good use of those assistive technologies like you named.
I agree, and I know that for older adults that a lot of medications that would be given to a younger adult don't work because the body, as it gets older, retains more toxic substances. And so, yeah, I think it needs to happen more often as we get older.
I do too, and it's a really good point because, elderly people in our society with the medical system we have, most of them are on multiple drugs. And when you combine that with not being able to detox as well, that's a setup for bad news.
I agree. Well, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
That kind of ties into my next question, Kat, is you kind of referred to the expressing of the illness, at the symptoms expressing some discordancy for the individual. Is that why it seems that our culture and our environment have become as toxic as they seem to be? What would your thoughts be on how we've made our food supply and an environment toxic in that regard?
I think some of it is that desire for the quick fix and that love we have of technological advances. And by technological, I mean everything from making plastics to whatever. We tend to leap first and look later. I think because of that notion, the very notion of progress, that we're always improving on the past, that the past needs to be improved on and we're going to make it better. And so anything new has that aura of it's going to be better. Every new drug that comes out, this is going to be better than the last ones, and then, 5-10 years on down the line, well, we didn't realize it was going to have this effect and that effect. We leap first, we try first and find out later. I think one of the hard things right now is that research is guided by ways of making money. And so we have a lot of research into drugs because drugs can be sold and people can make money off of that. But it's hard to fund research for looking at, for example, environmental causes of illness, because who's going to make money off of that? So we kind of stick ourselves in a corner and add to our helplessness by that driving force to progress and have that progress be identified with profit.
Yeah, the objectification again. That newest thing obviously is better than the old thing because I'm going to make money on this new thing. Yeah. I see it with sleep medicines now because insomnia is so pervasive. And they talk about generations of new drugs for bettering sleep. Now the generations are pretty much defined by when the last set became generic, then the new set comes out. And because it's so hard to make money off of a generic. And every time, this is going to be better than the last one. Sometimes we do arrive at something that's better than the last one. It's possible, but not even probable at this point. Right. Well, again, another article that I just read yesterday or today is that there's reference to a study that shows a direct causation of feeding antibiotics to livestock and the occurrence of MRSA in humans.
Oh, wow. That's great. I mean, I'm great that the research showed it. I'm happy that we know that.
The condition isn't so great, but that we're finding this out, for those short-term profit-minded activities. We can sell more animal if it's fatter, right?
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Interesting. Thanks for sharing that, Chipper Dog.
You're welcome.
Kat, earlier you mentioned Martin Prichtel, and I've been interested in his work, especially as a shaman from Guatemala. But What does the shamanic path of soul retrieval have to do with illness? How do the shamans make use of it?
Well, I'd have to speak from my personal experience and the reading I've done. Since I'm not a shamanic practitioner and I'm not of an indigenous culture, grew up with shamanic practitioners, but my understanding is they're addressing more the spiritual, energetic level of things, and the illness is understood to, in a sense, I guess the way I would think of it is that it's kind of the opposite of scientific materialism. Scientific materialism says matter is first, and consciousness and anything else is derived from matter. The brain is the mind, that kind of thinking. And the shamanic perspective is the other way around. It says the spirit, the energy, the invisible is the creative force, is the original. And our bodies, our material worlds, our physical worlds are a manifestation of what's going on energetically and spiritually. So illness then, or some kind of physical disorder, is understood to be a manifestation of a spiritual disorder or mishap or imbalance or something along those lines. And that to get to the source of the illness then is to go to the spiritual level. The physical will follow suit. And in terms of soul retrieval itself, there's a notion that in many indigenous cultures that our souls, have a relationship with our bodies, but it's not as tight as we like to think. And there are times when our souls travel apart from our bodies, like when we dream, for example. Dreaming is, by most indigenous cultures around the world, understood to be travels of the soul, and that when we are ready to wake up, our souls need to come back into our bodies. And that's one reason why in so many indigenous cultures, you don't suddenly wake someone. You wait for them to wake up, you gently call their name, you play music for a while, because you don't want to shock someone into waking up. Their soul may not be able to get back into their bodies. Many illnesses are understood to be a manifestation of some kind of separation or division or disharmony between the soul and the body. And sometimes it's very literally, it can feel like the soul didn't get back up, or back into the body, or one of the person's souls is still lost out there. And
Yes.
that's why the illness. And so in that, if that's understood to be cause of an illness, then it makes sense that retrieving that soul, bringing that part of that person's self back home, would be essential to recovering from illness. In my experience, it was not so much with my illness and my work with Martine, it was not so much that my soul was lost or needed to be retrieved, so much as it is that my soul had taken on the task of carrying the ancestral sin.
Yes.
And embodying it in order for it to be addressed. So what was needed there was addressing that, in a sense, that original sin. And he said, I remember him telling me that the native peoples who had been displaced from the land that became my family's land had put a curse on the family that the name would die out. And in fact, in my generation, with me and my cousins, even though there were 24 of us who had the name, not a one of us who was able to carry it on was having children.
That's amazing.
And after we did that ceremony, about a year and a half, 2 years later, a cousin of mine, a male cousin of mine, had a child, and the name was carried into the next generation.
Wow. Well, I'm listening to you and thinking these indigenous cultures knew so much, and thankfully science is beginning to return to that now, that our consciousness is primary, that we aren't our brain, our consciousness, we are our consciousness. And so I'm delighted that we're moving back to that.
Yes.
That's wonderful. And listening to you, I'm recalling several of my own illnesses where it was an experience of going walkabout, so to speak, and retrieving so much. And sometimes it wasn't even my own ancestral stuff. It was the place I was at.
Oh, interesting.
Yes. So I really appreciate that we're beginning to explore these areas, that it isn't just a slab of meat, to fix.
Yes.
That we're much more than that. And the body is just a manifestation of the consciousness. But and this ties into... Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Kat.
And in a parallel way, the earth isn't just a bunch of earth, that it is a living presence with its own histories, its each place having its own lineages.
Absolutely. Yes, and it's interesting for people who travel to have an awareness of any body symptoms or what they're experiencing when they go to different places, and if they're the type of person that might pick up the physical wounds of the earth in a particular place or a particular culture.
That's very interesting, yes.
Yes. But in your book, I think this ties in. You spoke about illness as a practice in dying, and that rang so true for me because there is this immense letting go process, and I wondered if you could speak about that a bit.
Yes. I remember one of my thoughts when I had been sick for some time. I thought, I think I'm learning what it's like to be old. I'm having practice being old, not being able to do as much, having limited energy, not being able to think as clearly, spending more time alone, all of that. Not as productive or out in the world, but also that when we're sick, it really feels like our bodies are calling the shots, and we're just being dragged along. And I imagine, since I don't have memory of dying, that's what it would feel like when you're dying, is that you ride along on this process that your body psyche is taking you through. It's also, I think, it's a Buddhist notion. It's in many parts of the world. Ancient Egypt understood that for kind of obvious reasons. Even if we aren't sick when we're dying, we look and might feel like we're sick. I mean, we're losing weight, we're not able to be and do the things we used to. And it calls for a different set of skills when we're sick or when we're dying than when we're healthy and well and middle-aged and going. I remember one day where I had to spend pretty much the day in bed, and I had a window near the bed where I could look out, see the branches of an aspen tree and the wind tickling those leaves. And I spent most of the day just looking at that. And I thought to myself, my gosh, if someone had ever said to me 10 years ago that I was going to spend a day doing this, I would have thought it would be impossible. I could never do it. I could never do that, that I couldn't handle it. But in fact, it wasn't hard to handle at all when the time came. And that gives me some comfort when I look into getting older and older and eventually dying, that I can call on those skills that I learned when I was ill.
That sounds like a beautiful gift you were given, and how wonderful you were able to go with that process.
Yes.
Lovely. But also, illness could be compared with a journey of initiation. And a place to go to discover or even explore the underworld. I wonder what your thoughts are on this as well.
Yes, I have a chapter talking about the underworld journey. I think
what initially drew my attention to that was that reading, I think it was Joan Halifax's Shamanic Voices, where she had talked and interviewed many shamans and asked them how they came into their profession. And many of them talked about a critical illness, a deathly illness that took them into their profession. And that got me kind of interested. And I started learning about initiation processes that have very kind of clear stages where you're separated from your family, the people in your world. You are taken into another reality or world. You are changed, and then you reemerge in that changed form. In a sense, it's kind of coming apart and being reassembled, dismembered and reassembled. And it can certainly feel like that when you're very sick, especially for any length of time. It feels like the person you used to be is gone, that it's either died or it's been mutilated to such an extent you can't recognize it anymore. And but it doesn't feel as though a new you has come forward, and it feels like you're in this liminal space in between. And it's very easy to feel like you are undergoing some kind of chemical transformation, because you know your body is doing all these weird things. You have these fevers, you sweats, you burp, you fart, you do all these things. You know, your body is like a flask, you know, in the alchemist's hands. It's just bubbling away. Identity feels like it's pretty well shredded up and boiled down. You don't know if you'll ever come back to any sense of identity, which maybe, now that I think about it, may relate to Sibel's question about identifying with illness. We may do that in part because we've lost our healthy identity, our identity that we had when we were healthy. And it's kind of hard to not have something to name ourselves as, or to know ourselves as, or to tell other people to know us as. And that may be why we're quick to identify with an illness at some point, or because it's become such a defining feature of our lives. But then that too is transitory, as the Buddhists will say. All things are, you know, constantly changing. And so even if someone has a chronic illness, it goes through its phases. Even if it's a progressive one, it's never a steady step-by-step decline. It's a come and go, drop and hop back up halfway, and you know, it's a kind of tumultuous ride. Eventually, change becomes the constant, in a sense. If I would say anything about the identity I've come out of illness, it would be I'm a little more identified with the fact of change, or change itself, than I was before, and less sure of any things I thought were solid before. But that's why I think of it as a kind of underworld journey. You are separated, you spend a lot of time asleep, a lot of time in dreams, and even if you aren't asleep, you're in stillness one way or another. It's like the monks, you know, in their rooms meditating. It's the hours and hours and hours of stillness, and not being able to be distracted by movement, by activity, by what's going on out there in the world. That is a part of that journey.
Absolutely, and I find it absolutely amazing that across so many cultures, the initiation process actually takes some familiar stages, and I think that speaks loudly about what this process does. And I've heard so many times about this dismembering, and quite often it's seen in dreams or meditations as an encounter with a power animal who literally shreds one to bits.
Mm-hmm.
or even the butterfly that turns to goo. The caterpillar turns into goo within the cocoon before this butterfly emerges.
Yeah.
And it's that letting go again and learning the process of we are not a constant I. And I wonder if that's what a lot of us are learning right now, that with all this accelerated change that's happening, that we aren't a static I, we are an evolving, constantly I.
That's a wonderful thought there, and I think it's probably true. And that we can complain about the pace of change and technological development and learning. Is so fast at this point. Maybe part of what that is taking us to is just realizing that life is change, we are change, everything is change. That's a very interesting point. It helps me feel more comfortable with that pace of change that is required of us at this time. It seems like the minute I learn my way on a computer, it's outdated and I have to get another one.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. What's the old saying? The only thing you can count on is change.
Oh,
It's so true. So
it's
true.
true.
Yeah.
And I have wondered whether illness itself, being such a common and constant feature of life, I mean, not constant, but, everyone has an illness one time or another, whether illness provided the original paradigm for the initiation processes. It's just a thought I've had.
I would think that would be a very strong possibility, because I know in every story I've ever read about initiation process and how a shaman is made, they always have some sort of profound illness where they hover on the edge of living or dying, and they go to the underworld and then come back, but not in an egoic self-centeredness as they were before, or as an uninitiated child, but they are there then for the greater good of their community or their tribe. And in other words, it's no longer a singular I, it's a we.
That's nice. That's very true.
Yeah. Wonderful thoughts. I have a lot to think about now. Thank you, Kat.
Well, thank you too. Yes, and it may be just what we need at this point in our Western civilization, is that return to the we.
Yes. Beyond just our nations as well.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Kat, this is Chipper again, and listening to you talk about that shaky identity. Not quite sure what that identity looks like on the far side of the illness. Sounds a lot like the dark night of the soul, as an individual type initiation.
I think it is very much like it. I think that the dark night of the soul is a kind of initiation. Yeah.
You've got a chapter in your book titled "The Dynamics of Shame and Scapegoating." Would you tell us about that? And it sounds again like that ties back to the social constraints that the productive mind, the objectified mind puts on growth. I don't. Could you tell us about that chapter and that dynamic?
Yeah. I was. I think at one point I had studied a lot of Greek mythology, and of course, the ancient Greeks believed that illness could result from the crimes of one's ancestors. And in fact, they had two goddesses that appeared whenever the natural order was violated. And one was called Nemesis, the power of righteous anger, and the other one was shame, Iris. And the Greek notion was that whenever the natural order was violated in some way, that these goddesses would appear, and that they were invoked. And in this notion, shame was sacred, It was an antidote for hubris, for the hubris that prompted someone or something to violate that natural order. It was generated when the bonds of trust were broken. And the tricky thing is that, and I'd have to say, this line of thinking I got a lot from Pat Sargent, one of my teachers, and also with the Appalachian notion of shame carriers. That shame is released when there is some violation, but it belongs to the violator, but it oftentimes lands on the violated or the victim. I've also seen this, of course, a lot in working with trauma survivors, rape survivors, domestic violence victims, where the victims, feel inherently bad and wrong and shamed and filthy by the very fact of their having been present for that violation and a part of that violation, even though they were victims to it. And so that shame can land with the victims or the ones that were violated. And so it can be a little harder to be brought back to the original violation. It's intended to right the original violation. But I think that when someone is a shame carrier, that shame builds up to a point where there's kind of a critical mass, and there has to be some kind of breakdown in order to return, as Susan was saying, with and for the community, to try to rebuild those bonds of trust that were broken. If not the actual ones that were initially broken, at least to build and foster bonds in the future to help repair that net that's been rent or torn. I don't know if that made sense. I hope
does,
it did.
And it goes right to my next question of how that could be how illness might be seen as a blessing.
Yes, well put. Absolutely. Because it leads us back to rejoin that community of life. Yes. That's very nicely put. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Kat, I was wondering if you'd like to talk a little bit about your new book that will be coming out, The Secret Life of Sleep. I noticed that on your blog, you mentioned that humans are the only animals that sleep alone, which is interesting. And I heard that infants often, when they sleep with their mothers, they're less likely to have sudden infant death syndrome because they're regulated by their mother's breathing and heart rate.
Yes.
So,
yes.
what would you like to say about sleep?
Yeah, I got very interested in sleep, partly because I just love it. And also, it's such a great remedy for whenever I feel like I go wrong or bad somehow. But, and then the more I investigated, the more interesting it got. Yes, humans, I think, are the only animals who sleep alone, and that habit of sleeping alone is very specific to the Euro-American tradition of the last couple hundred years. So it's a very recent and specific development. And there's more and more research suggesting that it was a mistake to go in that direction. That we are, as infants, because we do so much development outside of the womb, our initial habitat is the bodies, our mother, our parents, our families, and we are regulated by the presence of another body in order to learning how to breathe, the immunity, all the temperature regulation in the body. So many things are regulated by that physical contact with a more mature being, and sleeping apart becomes problematic in that way. And even more problematic is the way many people were taught, and still are taught some, to train a child to sleep alone, which is to let them cry it out.
Abandoning a crying infant, not responding, builds a stress system in that infant that becomes hardwired, so that people with that kind of background will become stress reactive later on as adults. So it's I could go on, but it's become a very interesting subject. Also because in the East, and Taoist, Buddhist, Hindu traditions, sleep was always recognized as an important part of life and an important part of consciousness. So there's a tradition that is carefully observed and utilized states of sleep in ways that in the West we have just ignored it as non-existent. Not as non-existent, but as carrying no consciousness, that we, the light went out and we didn't think, and then we woke up and we are awake again and we're conscious again. In the East, the understanding was that we're conscious throughout the many stages of sleeping and waking. And so there's this huge body of knowledge about sleep that actually correlates in many ways to the most recent neuroscientific discoveries about sleep. So it's become a very interesting project. And yes, it has found a publisher here in the United States and in the UK, another publisher. So we're looking at next spring for it to come out.
That's great. Yeah, sleep is something that in my youth I just totally ignored. But as I've grown older, I've come to really appreciate. I think it will be I look forward to reading your book.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. It's been really fun to work on. And as I worked on it, I realized it's not unlike The Alchemy of Illness in that I'm taking a subject that's very much part of our lives but tends to be ignored, and just evoking it and shining a lot of light on it and looking at it from many different perspectives. I guess that's my MO, and it's really an enjoyable process for me.
Sounds like a lot of fun.
Kat, this is Susan again, and is there anything else you would like to speak about that we haven't done so yet?
Nothing comes to mind. We've covered a lot of things here.
We have.
We have, yes.
Okay, and is there anything you'd like to share with us about what you're doing now? I know that you're writing the new book, and you're also working as a counselor.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I work as a counselor, and I also am a child forensic interviewer, so I interview kids in cases of suspected abuse. I work with law enforcement and social services. I used to run that program. Now I'm a backup interviewer 1 day a week. But I've been involved with in the field of trauma and trauma recovery for many, many years. Other than that, just trying to be a human being.
Oh, that sounds like a good plan. And
Yeah.
do you have anything else you would like to share with us? Your website what's the name of your website now?
It is The Secret Life of Sleep, is my blog. And I do have a website on Facebook, an author website or page, author page, I guess is what they call it. My blog, I had to stop writing for a little while when this book was getting close to the publishers, because I wasn't sure how to handle the issue of if I write about something in the blog, can it be in the book or not? And so I thought, well, I'll just wait to talk to a publisher about it. So we're about to have that conversation. I'll be able to go back to blogging again.
Wonderful. I do want to say that I read your book probably over 15 years ago, and consistently it has been the one book I have recommended over and over and over again, and I thoroughly recommend it to anybody. Even if you're not sick, it's just a fabulous, thoughtful, insightful read. Soulful comes to mind. I really want to thank you for a wonderful conversation. I think we've all enjoyed it. It's been an absolute delight speaking with you, Kat. Your gentleness and your compassion and empathy shine brightly, as well as your wisdom. It's very apparent. And hopefully we can have you back again and speak more about your new book when that comes out, if you would be open to doing so. But Yeah, on behalf of Sky Blue, we really, really thank you. And I know our listeners will love this. And as you said, we're talking about the things that our culture and society don't talk about.
Hmm. Well, thank you so much yourselves. It is such a delight to have such interesting and insightful questions and to carry on a conversation like this with like-minded souls. I have so enjoyed this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kat.
It was.
Thanks, Kat. Really, it was great.
Thank you. Thank you all.